Okay, guys, I am going to kind of go through the Unit 6 as fast as I can. But I want to start with kind of reviewing some finer points about the DBQ. I posted a video that Mr. Vestal created about DBQ writing, and maybe he is a lot more succinct and clear than I've been, because it doesn't hurt to hear things from different people, right? So even if we say the same things, maybe we say it in a different way that makes it click for you. So fingers crossed, it helps some people. So, but just to kind of like lay things out, you should have multiple paragraphs. Your introduction paragraph should be more than just your thesis. Your introduction paragraph should include some kind of setup as to what your argument is and your thesis, your actual argument. Your argument must answer all parts of the prompt. That's your introduction paragraph. It should be like 5 to 9 sentences, depending upon how in depth you go on your contextualization statements. Then you should have at least 2 body paragraphs, if not up to 4, depending upon how fast you write and how you're organizing your essay. I will say that this is a 7 document DBQ, so if you have to use all of the documents, or you should use at least 6, but that's, hoping that you use all 6 of them correctly. So I always say use 7, CYB, cover your butt, cover your bases, however you want to interpret that. Make sure that you get your points for all 6 documents that you need on the rubric. But if you are only to do 2 body paragraphs, that means you need 3 to 4 documents, plus all of the analysis, plus potential outside evidence, plus topic sentences, plus clincher sentences. So you're, as you can see, the size of that body paragraph starts to grow. So if there's a way for you to organize into 3 categories with this 7 document DBQ, it's actually to your benefit, because it helps you stay on point for the most part, and it keeps things pretty tight and concise. And then the 4th body paragraph is if you are able to and can write an analysis paragraph, which again is, if you get to it, great, try it. If you don't, it's not going to kill your grade. If you don't, you can still get a pretty high A without an analysis paragraph, okay? Like a 95 if I'm correct. I mean, I wrote the rubric. I'm pretty sure I'm correct. Okay. So your thesis, you have to have an introduction paragraph, body paragraphs. You do not have to have a conclusion paragraph unless you have a couple of minutes and you want to kind of sum up everything. And if you are a I write to my thesis person, then conclusion paragraphs are great. But otherwise, don't worry about it. You should not, when using documents, here are the things you should do. You should tell me what the document is about in your own words. You should support your argument, show how that document actually supports what you're trying to say, and you should try to analyze some kind of lens on the document: historical situation, intended audience, the author's purpose or the author's point of view. Those things are really important as a way to kind of analyze the document to see its relevancy and its significance to not only your argument, but also to history in general, to the topic. You should not directly quote. I'm going to say that again because people seem to not believe me. Do not write word for word from a document. Is it going to lead to points off? No, because that's not how the rubric works. Is it going to waste your time, your very valuable time that you have so little of? Yeah, because it doesn't count by itself. Even if you put the quote in, you have to explain what that quote says. If you don't explain what that quote says, then it doesn't count. If you put in the quote and then skip straight to support and lens, but never talk about what it actually says, guess what? You don't get credit for that. A quote by itself without any explanation does not count, okay? So it is a waste of time to quote, period. Your contextualization needs to be fully fleshed out. Your outside evidence needs to be fully fleshed out, meaning you can't just name drop or just like, hey, the Kangani system existed. No, sorry. You have to tell me what the Kagani system is and how it relates to your argument and the topic. You constantly, always be connecting to your thesis. The ABCs of an argumentative essay is that you are always connecting to your thesis. Always be connecting. And honestly, guys, I don't care if it helps you to just write, this connects to my thesis. This is relevant to my argument. This is important because, okay? While that's not like outstanding writing, remember, this is a rough draft. I know it's a rough draft. It's even a rough draft written under duress, under serious strains of stress. Okay? I get that. So I don't care if that phrase is in there, if that helps you actually make the connections you need to make. Okay, I think those are my most important parts. If you, like I said, there's a video from Mr. Vestal where he kind of walks back through it. And then, of course, there are all my previous videos. So now let's talk Unit 6 review chart. And I'm basically just going to go through Spice Tea, answering the questions that are presented. So, social. What are social changes brought about by imperialism and migrations in terms of gender roles, ethnic and racial construction, class structures, and what are continuities? Many Europeans will use imperialism as another method of creating racial hierarchies based on a strict interpretation of the word civilized. We talked about this at the beginning of the year. This is pretty much summed up by in the poem by Kipling, White Man's Burden. And this narrow definition based on industrialization status led to the basis of opinions regarding other countries and races, and also justifying the conquest and takeover of global regions. Increasingly, Europeans viewed the culture and achievements of Asian and African peoples through the prism of what is known as scientific racism. So that's basically this crop of pseudosciences that arise justifying a racial hierarchy. And by pseudosciences, I mean some stuff like phrenology and craniology and social Darwinism, a way of scientifically supporting racism. In case you don't know what phrenology and craniology is, that's like measuring the bumps on your head and the size of your head to indicate some kind of greater brain size. It's weird. But in many places and for many people, incorporation into European colonial empires was a traumatic experience, especially for small-scale societies. So the loss of homes and life and cattle and crops and land was hugely devastating. And it led to major disruptions in their society and how they ran things and how they just interacted with each other. So their class systems were upended, their gender roles were upended. For the Vietnamese elite, who had been schooled for centuries in Chinese-style Confucianism, French conquest of Vietnam will badly disrupt their society. Many of those elite will mourn the loss of their culture, and instead of trying to work within the French government, because some of them were offered jobs within the French colonial government, they'll actually withdraw from public life, and they're like, nope, not taking part in this. And so it's an even greater loss of culture. Imperial powers, for both political and humanitarian efforts, had an interest in promoting Western education or European education standards. And this does open up quite a few opportunities for classes in these colonial societies that may not have had these opportunities previously. In fact, education is not only an easy indoctrination tool to get people to support the colonial power or colonial structure, but it will actually lead to a power shift from traditional elites to this new Western educated class that now starts to take over government positions and are in charge of implementing the rules and regulations passed down from the imperial powers. Imperialism and migration will lead to increased roles for women as men migrate out and are looking for jobs that are in high demand. So women are now forced to take on what are traditionally men's roles. Great example of that is in China and in Africa. It also often leads to polygamy because you have so few men that men will marry multiple women, because in these patriarchal societies that have been patriarchal for forever, it's really important that a woman has the protection, the social protection at the very least, of a man to support her endeavors. New immigrants will introduce new cultures into the receiving societies. It'll create ethnic enclaves. It'll create a social hierarchy in the receiving societies. It will influence culture, and we'll get to that in a minute. But it will also influence politics in the receiving societies, and we'll get to that in a minute too. In fact, we'll get to that right now. Okay, so political. So that was social. I know that was a lot. Political. What are the causes for policy decisions, especially how the imperialist powers take over and create an empire? What are reactions, especially different wars and rebellions that arise as a result? So, what made imperialism so broadly popular in Europe, especially in the last quarter of the century, was the growth of mass nationalism. The motivating force for policy decisions in European countries was this idea of we are number one, and to maintain our number one status, we have to take on more colonies. So these European rivalries, France and Germany and Great Britain, they had always been fighting with each other, and now these rivalries are going to be pushed onto the global stage because now they're going to start fighting over colonies and who can amass the greatest colonial empire. So colonies or spheres of influence abroad signified great strength and power status. Europeans preferred an informal control through economic dominion this time around, as opposed to wholesale colonial takeover. For a few reasons, it was cheaper. They didn't have to create a huge, massive government political structure in the colonial holding, and they also wanted to avoid triggering war or resistance, because if they tried to do wholesale invasion, that usually led to some kind of massive native resistance. Just to be clear, though, that doesn't mean that imperial powers were above military force, or at least the threat of force. Remember, their technology is far superior militarily than many of these smaller countries that are taken over. It's really hard to, the saying, don't bring a knife to a gunfight is a thing for a reason, right? If you bring a knife and somebody has a gun, they don't have to get anywhere close to you and you're dead, right? Whereas a knife is very close contact kind of thing. The Berlin Conference, the subsequent scramble for Africa, took about 25 years, basically led to the carving up of an entire continent in an effort to assuage the nationalistic desire for more and greater empires. And this took serious military efforts to conquer and subdue native populations, especially in Africa and in parts of Asia. The French against I just blanked on his name. Crap. The French in West Africa, I'll remember it when we're talking about China here in a minute. The French in West Africa are going to fight against the native populations. It's going to drag on for 16 years. It's going to be very bloody, and the French are going to win, but at a very high cost. The British in South Africa, first with the Anglo-Zulu War, and putting down the Zulu people in South Africa, and then against the old Dutch colonists in the Boers and the Boer Wars. These were all examples of European powers forcing their control on a highly resistant population. Japan joined the imperial game by taking control of Taiwan and Korea, which were traditionally Chinese tribute states. So there are major, massive political changes. Boundaries are changing. Who controls what is changing. Who are the powerhouses versus who's not is also changing. for instance, in the old version of imperialism, the Spanish and the Portuguese were like super dominant. But by this point, we're talking Great Britain, France, Japan, Germany. These are your big ones. They are huge. Russia's making a huge play. Chinese power is down. Indian power is down. Muslim power is down. American power is up. After all those revolutions, you now have all of these American nation states that have grown, and especially the United States of America. They have become an industrial power that will start to rival the power of the British. Okay, so while violence was a prominent feature of colonial life, there were groups and countries that willingly cooperated with colonial power structures for their own advantage. So many men will find employment through recruitment from these imperial powers to migrate and work on plantations in various parts of the world, and they'll make money to send home to their families. This is employment they could not have found in their home societies. Other men found status and security in the European-led armed forces. Think about the sepoys in India who will work in the colonial military and government. In addition, the shortage and expense of European administrators and the difficulties of communicating across cultural lines, meaning language barriers, required a reliance anyway on a range of local intermediaries. So Indian princes and Muslim emirs and African rulers will find it possible to retain much of their earlier status and privileges through cooperation with the colonial power. This will help them maintain that power, maintain their wealth, increase their wealth in some instances. In French West Africa, by I think the 1920s, the colonial state consisted of just under 400 French administrators. We're talking all of French West Africa, less than 400 French administrators, and 50,000 African chiefs that were in charge as intermediaries that were able to maintain some power, status, and wealth through working in cooperation with the colonial power. All that said, even in colonies that proved willing to a point, eventually unrest and opposition will arise. Some great examples of that are going to be the Opium Wars. Not that China was super open to colonization or economic dominion or spheres of influence, but it's the Opium Wars that actually forced their hand. So that proves problematic. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, those same sepoys that I mentioned earlier, they will change the type of fat that is used to oil various mechanical parts of guns and cannons to a cow fat, like a lard, and this will offend many Hindu sepoys, and it sparks mutiny, and this mutiny ultimately becomes about something else, but it starts with something very small, and it starts with the cultural, either purposeful or inadvertent misunderstanding. The Modest Revolt is another good example where people in Egypt are trying to revolt against the colonial powers by following an Egyptian leader. All of these are put down by the imperial powers, but once again, it takes serious effort to do so. Interaction with the environment. How does imperialism affect the environment of the colonized countries? What are examples of shifts in agriculture, industry? How does mass migration impact the environment? Okay, so while old imperialism focused primarily on the Americas, imperialism in the 18th and 19th centuries was focused in Asia, Africa, and Oceania. So for the first time in a big way, we have imperial powers making global statements in Oceania. Unlike the experience, Europe and the Americas had been drawn into the world of Pacific Oceania through exploration and scientific curiosity, right? So Darwin, through exploration of what's happening in the Pacific, they will encounter a series of islands. Even in the Empire's DBQ, when we had Magellan, the document about Magellan, that is, again, them, entering into those specific islands. Except, unlike the experiences in Asia and Africa, where there was essentially economic dominion, Oceania was conquered much the same way as the Americas itself had been. So there were large settler populations that will move into these islands, bringing with them the European diseases that all the people that were immune to, and it reduced native populations by upwards of 75%. Aboriginal Australians, the Maori in New Zealand, and native Hawaiians were reduced to minority population status, due to their interaction with European powers and decimation by disease. So at that point, they will lose most, if not all, say or representation in the new leadership and political structures. But this change in population is the part about the environment that is really key through the spreading of disease. Other ways that imperialism impacts the environment, the creation of cash crop economies, monocultures, and the use of cultivation system in which peasants were required to cultivate 20% of or more of their land in cash crops like sugar or coffee or cacao. And that was their tax obligation. They did that to meet their tax obligation to the state, to the imperial state. The problem is that these systems made the environment vulnerable to not just soil destruction, but actually the decimation of entire harvests due to pests. Because if you have a monoculture and one pest gets to that single crop, that one pest decimates all of it. And if you've put all of your eggs in one basket and all of the eggs break, that means that you have nothing at the end of it. And so this often led to mass famine and death of the native population, or the labor population at least. Okay, culture. How are different cultures, language, religion, food, dress altered by imperialism and migration? So imperialism led to changing power structures, but often needed weakening or crumbling structures to exist in the first place. For instance, the Mughal Empire falls, at the end of the Gunpowder Empire, or Gunpowder era, I guess. And it leaves many in the Indian subcontinent without any kind of unifying cultural identity. And so a lot of the old cultural identities start to fight against each other. Without that unifying force. And so what happens is the British are able to come in and kind of fill in those cracks and take advantage and slowly take over and fill the vacuums that the Mughal Empire left behind in their absence. So they basically, it leads to mass migration to and from India. This also includes the development of ethnic enclaves in various societies. So receiving societies will have like Chinese enclaves that will work on plantations, and the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, they will share their culture. They brought Peruvian cuisine and cooking styles and melded them together. You have Indian enclaves, you have Irish enclaves, you have an entire African diaspora that is grown. So when all of this happens, women begin again going back and taking over men's roles. Okay. Economic. I'm going to actually stop here and I'll pick this back up later because economics is going to take me a little bit of time and the bell is about to ring for my next class. All right.